Most founders spend years building their startup, but when it comes time to actually sell, they walk into a process designed to take money out of their pocket. What I've learned from being part of over hundreds of exits is that the founders who walk away with the most money aren't always the ones with the best businesses. They're the ones who understand how buyers think and how deals actually get done. So in this video, I'm going to share the biggest lessons from every exit I've worked on so you know exactly what to watch for and how to protect yourself when it's your time to sell. Let's dive in. Understanding the exit process. First, let's understand the exit process. There are really just 5 stages to any exit. First, you sign an NDA and have initial conversations. Then you negotiate and sign an LOI, which is a letter of intent that outlines the deal terms. Up next is due diligence and the purchase agreement, where everything gets finalized. Then finally, closing, where you actually get paid. What most founders don't realize is the positions you establish early set the trajectory for the entire deal. Whatever you agree to in the LOI will follow you into the final documents, and it's very hard to backtrack once you've agreed to something. The best way to think of it is like it's dating. So NDA is the talking stage, LOI is actually dating, and the purchase agreement is marriage. And just like dating, if they won't commit at the early stages, it only gets harder later. How deal structures actually work. So now you know the process. Let's talk about how most deal structures actually work. The first thing to know is buyers rarely pay you everything in cash at close. They'll present an attractive number, but it's usually broken into pieces. A $5 million offer might actually be $2.5 million cash, $1 million in a seller note, $1 million earnout, and $500K rollover equity. That means half your money is either delayed or at risk. Because seller notes are loans from you to the buyer pays you back over 12 to 36 months. So if they tank the business, you may never see that money. Buyers typically ask for 10 to 20% of the purchase price as a seller note, but you can protect yourself by securing it against the business assets so you can get the business back if they default. You also need to know that earnouts link your payout to future performance. This is usually revenue or profit milestones over 1 to 3 years. For example, if profit was $1 million at the time of sale, the buyer may say, hit $1.5 million within 12 months and we'll pay you an additional $1 million. The problem is you no longer control the business, but your money depends on decisions that the buyer is now making. So you should always push for reporting and auditing rights so you can actually track progress. And it's going to be important to define the metrics as clearly as possible in the LOI, not later. Rollover equity is also common with private equity buyers. This means you reinvest part of your payout into the new company. The pitch is you get a second bite when they sell at a higher valuation, which can be attractive, but you need to understand you're now a minority shareholder with limited control. Finally, you should watch how working capital is defined. Debt-free, cash-free sounds simple, but the definitions matter. Buyers often define customer prepayments as debt. So if you collected annual subscriptions, you may owe back the undelivered months. I've seen purchase prices reduced by as much as $600K at the last minute because of this. Finding and qualifying buyers. So once you understand deal structures, the next question is who you should actually be selling to. Something most founders miss is you should be doing as much due diligence on buyers as they do on you. Push for a mutual NDA so you have the right to evaluate them too. And if they're using SBA financing, ask to see their term sheet from the bank. Or if they're a PE group, ask for financial statements or proof of funds, because you need to know they can actually close before you invest months in this process. This also shows whether a buyer is serious or not. If they won't sign a simple NDA, that tells you something about how they'll actually behave later. Or if they're dragging on the LOI, they'll drag on everything else too. So watch for buyers who seem more interested in collecting information than actually closing a deal. And be especially careful with competitors too. They may show interest just to get access to your customer lists, vendors, and business model, so make sure your NDA includes a non-solicitation clause and phase the release of information so that you're not exposing everything before you know that they're serious. Negotiation tactics that protect you. Now let's talk about the actual negotiation and how to protect yourself throughout. The first thing I always tell founders is to set a hard closing date and stick to it. Buyers would happily do endless due diligence if you let them, but a deadline applies pressure and keeps momentum in the deal. And if they miss it, that shows how serious they actually are. You also want to limit exclusivity as much as possible. Exclusivity means you can't talk to other buyers during that window. So push for 30 to 45 days maximum. If they're not going to commit, they need to move on so that you can talk to others. And remember, the LOI can always be amended if they genuinely need more time. But the biggest thing to understand is what you're actually promising in reps and warranties. These are statements you make about your business being true. And if anything turns out to be false, the buyer can come after you for damages. So the disclosure schedule, where you list exceptions, is your protection. Be thorough and transparent there, because anything you don't disclose can come back to haunt you. Which brings us to indemnification. And this is where sellers really need to pay attention. Indemnification is basically your exposure after the deal closes, meaning how much you could owe the buyer if something goes wrong. So the goal is to limit that exposure as much as possible, and there are a few ways to do it. First is using baskets, which work like a deductible on an insurance policy. The buyer can only come after you once their total damages hit a certain threshold. So for example, if the basket is $50,000 and they have $30,000 in claims, they can't collect anything. This stops the buyer from coming after you for every small thing once the deal is done. Second is caps, which limit your total liability to a percentage of the purchase price. So if everything goes wrong, there's a ceiling on what you owe. Without a cap, you could end up owing more than you actually made from the sale. And third, if there's a seller note involved, watch out for set-off provisions. These let the buyer deduct damages directly from the payments they still owe you. So instead of having to sue you and prove their case, they just withhold money. That puts them in control, which is why you want to limit or remove set-off rights if you can. Finally, here are some common buyer tactics to watch out for. Some buyers might start with an attractive all-cash offer, then restructure it piece by piece during due diligence. This gets you emotionally committed to a number that was never real. So push for clarity on deal structure in the LOI before you agree to exclusivity. Another common thing is defining working capital terms in ways that reduce your payout at the very end. The buyer will set a target for how much cash, inventory, and receivables should be in the business when they take over. If the actual numbers come in below that target, they deduct the difference from your purchase price. The problem is, buyers can define things in their favor, like counting certain items as debt that you thought were normal operating expenses. So you think you're getting 5 million, but their calculation says working capital is short and now it's 4.4 million. To avoid this, get clear definitions of what counts as working capital, debt, and cash during the LOI stage, not after you're already locked in. And dragging out exclusivity while they fish for better deals or gather information is a typical tactic as well. Meanwhile, you've stopped talking to other buyers and lost months. So set hard deadlines and be willing to walk if they keep stalling without good reason. Timeline expectations. So let's talk about how long this actually takes and what to expect. For most exits, a realistic timeline looks like this. You'll start with initial conversations, and that usually takes a few weeks to get to a signed LOI. From there, it's usually between 45 to 90 days to go from LOI to having the signed purchase agreement. And during that time, due diligence is happening at the same time as negotiation of the purchase agreement. Then, right at the end, usually the last thing before closing, you'll finalize the disclosure schedules and the purchase price allocation. But deals drag all the time, and it's usually for preventable reasons. The most common one is messy documentation, because when the buyer's team has to chase information, everything slows down. That leads to more scrutiny, and that's when unresolved equity issues surface, like a former employee suddenly claiming they were promised shares, or worse, the buyer discovers missing IP assignments. And now they won't close until they're certain the company actually owns its assets. The point is, all of this can be avoided if you start your legal cleanup before you go to market, not after you already have a buyer waiting. The bigger point here is that momentum matters, and it matters more than most founders realize. The longer a deal takes, the more chances for something to go wrong. Because market conditions change, buyers get cold feet, key employees get nervous and leave, just to name a few things. So if a buyer is stalling without good reason, treat that as a red flag. Your job is to keep pressure on the deal while staying ready to walk if they're not 100% serious. Look, every deal is different. But the founders who protect themselves are the ones who understand how buyers think and what to watch out for before they're in the middle of a deal. So if you're thinking about selling your company, or you've already started conversations with buyers, and you want to make sure you're protected, click the first link in the description to book a free consultation with me. We'll look at where you are, identify anything that could harm your deal, and we'll make sure that you're set up to get the best possible outcome. So again, click that link below to book. And if you want to watch another video about protecting your startup, then watch this video next.